Welcome, friends. We are so glad you're here. We're just going to give everybody a minute to get in this morning. Just going to welcome a few more friends in. I hope you're having a great day today. And I know you're excited to hear from Jason and Roz. I was sharing with them how I love how practical they are, how they're sharing, we can bring it into our local context and we can use it. And last week was such a gift. I really appreciated their sharing and diving into from franchise to local dive. I told Jason, I got to go try those zombie hot dogs one day, but otherwise I give thanks and praise. All right, I think everybody's in. So why don't we just pause and take a moment and give thanks to God if you'll pray with me. God, we thank you that you continue to create in us, and you have told us what the better part is. And so today we choose you again and again. We, above all, seek to sit at your feet and to hear your voice and your calling and your direction in our lives. So speak this day through Jason and Roz, that we might hear what you might have to say to us today, and then we might live out your gospel in our daily lives. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, Jason and Roz, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, how's everybody doing today? Hope you're doing well. I hope you have plans to go to your favorite local dive or franchise today for lunch when this is all over. Roz and I are just coming off of a day yesterday where we were with the Great Plains Conference of the United Methodist Church doing the seminar version of Franchise to Local Dive. So we've just spent a whole day really working with this material again. We talked today about the idea that we would cover chapter 3 and 4, and we'll have some conversation about that. Roz, anything you want to say to get us started?
Yeah, drop in the chat your favorite local dive and maybe just share why or your favorite thing on the menu. So go ahead and just take a moment to do that right now.
You're not that far from us here in West Ohio, so we could always drive up and find your favorite local dives next time we're in the area. So I would have to say that chapter 3 in the book is probably one of the most important chapters of the book, and it's where we get into the idea of sort of planning the meal, the relationship between what exists and what you're building. And we find that if you don't do the proper amount of work up front to get your church, whatever you're planting, whether it's a new worship experience, whether you're starting a new campus, whether you're starting a new expression of online worship, whether you're merging two churches, we find that if you don't really do the work up front to have a shared understanding of the relationship between the new thing and the old thing, there are some real challenges that are a part of that. And so I'm just, we wrote the book and it's been a while since I've read it. So I was skimming this morning again, remembering, but we had some reflection questions in there that might be a good place for us to start, unless you have any other thoughts, Roz, that you want to throw out.
That's the table. Jason, let's go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you were frozen for a second there.
Unstable.
Yeah.
Sorry. Jason, if you can, why don't you put the continuum on the screen for us?
Yep.
I know you're way better at that than I am.
I can do that. 1 second here.
It'll let me. Here's what we mean by that. So oftentimes whenever we're starting something new or we're revitalizing something, say you're gonna start a new service or a fresh expression of worship, a lot of times we're asking, what is the relationship between the inherited church or structure and the new thing or the re-envisioned thing that you're trying to do? Because a lot of times those conversations aren't had, and when they're not had, it can create some really some challenges, I would say, because people are ultimately looking for who is decision maker in all this, who has final say and authority. It also clears up misconceptions as well, because a lot of times there's explicit and implicit expectations that we know about. And so if you're starting a new work, say you're starting just a non-traditional worship, for instance, um, the traditional worship leader may have the expectation that they're going to oversee both those things. And in all reality, you may not want the traditional worship leader overseeing the non-traditional worship, or a certain committee having the say or power. Jason, why don't you go ahead and kind of just fill us in more on that?
Sure. So we say in the book, and I hope that you picked up on this, that we don't think that franchises are bad and local dives are good. We think they both have merits. After all, a franchise has something worth replicating, but how can you allow that new thing, whether it's a new service, new campus, or whatever, have its own sort of flavor, its own deal? In the book, you will recognize that we talk to a number of different planting congregations, and we've seen sort of two ends of the spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, we have churches that are more franchise-like, that are more uniform. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to have a shared understanding of that. On the other side of the continuum, we have folks that are more autonomous, and that's more local dive-like. So there's a lot of freedom to kind of do new things. We think some of the best relationships are those where there's an interdependence, where the planting organization or entity has sort of a to and from kind of a back and forth relationship. Keep in mind that the planter can learn a lot from the plantee, or the original expression of worship can learn a lot from the new expression of worship, and so on and so forth. So as we were writing the book, we talked to probably 8 or 9 different really incredible planters, and we've heard some conversations that give us that whole spectrum. One of my favorite churches to have visited, and one of our favorite pastors, is Jacob Armstrong, and his the relationship he has with Jason McAnally. Jacob planted a church called Providence Church. Was that a parachute drop, Roz? Do you remember? That was not started from another church, right?
I don't think so.
I think they started it from scratch. And of course,
Yeah.
they started to grow. They have built a new building. I think they started off in high school and things like that. And as they got healthier, as they began to grow, there was another church in closer to downtown Nashville that really needed some help, and asked for Providence Church to adopt them. So now they are 2 churches, not merged, but a sort of a parent-daughter type relationship, but very much on the autonomous end, on the local dive end of that continuum. When I talked to Jacob, he said there's probably only about 20% of our congregation that even recognizes that we have a relationship between our 2 churches, but we're providing financial support, we're providing all the administrative type work, those sorts of things. But Providence Church did not say, since we have adopted you, you're now going to become Providence West, our West Campus. The other church, Jason McAnally's church, is called Home Church, and they will always be Home Church. They have their own logo. They have a very different look and feel in their space. They do worship that is very indigenous. They are basically a local dive that is supported by another kind of local dive. So that's a choice, because we also have friends like Adam Weber. Adam is one of the most successful planters in the United Methodist Church, and has 4 or 5 different campuses in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He started with nothing, started with no building or anything, and built a church up, and it grew, and they started another campus and so on. But every single campus of Embrace Church, you're going to see the Embrace logo. You're going to see the same color blue. Everything looks exactly the same. They're all called Embrace with the campus name. They have Adam, they take Adam's message and broadcast it at all of the campuses. So it's very much more of a franchise where things are uniform, and that's okay too. What Adam told us is that in time, they had a week or something where technology wasn't working quite right. And if I recall correctly, it's in the book. And their local pastors in the various locations had to preach the sermon that week. And he said the feedback they got was just tremendous, that people really loved having that kind of local voice also share the sermon. So Adam said, we've actually been in a process over the last few years of becoming more or less franchise-like, and not just pumping in my message to all of the locations, but doing more and more with the local settings. So there are a number of things that we talk about in the book, and we could start to maybe get into some of those. But you just have to choose up front. When you start that new worship experience, what's the relationship between the old and the new? How autonomous is it going to be? Do they have to do the same series? How uniform is it, or how autonomous is it? And if you don't have a shared understanding of those things, you will have constant tension. Maybe, Roz, you could talk a little bit about what you experienced in.
Jason,
Go ahead. Your internet's a little choppy today,
just,
Roz.
give a further explanation. The internet's choppy. Let me switch.
So Roz is having some internet challenges there. He's breaking up. He's usually a little more animated than he is right now. Are you back?
Is that better?
No, unfortunately, I don't think
better. Can you hear me?
Not really. We're getting you. You're really kind of broken up. I'm going to move just so you know I'm not broken up. All right. Yeah, I think we may have lost him. Maybe the rapture happened and we just didn't make it. All right, there he is. He's plugging in. All right. So I'll until Roz is back up and running. It looks like he's back. Are you there?
Can you hear me? Am I here?
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yay. Okay. So, we've just referenced two larger size models, but here's how it relates to even smaller churches. When you start maybe a fresh expression or an alternative service, the tension could be, hey, these people aren't going to come to my service here I'll just pick on in the traditional setting, or they're going to go to Bibles and Burritos at Moe's Diner or whatever. Thus, why would we pay for this? Why would this count? They're never going to come and sit in the pew and hold the hymnal. And so this is where the conversation needs to happen in terms of getting that definition of relationship. Jason, if you could put that continuum back on the screen again of franchise to the autonomous deal there. And while he's putting that back up, so what is that exactly going to look uniform with that relationship between the inherited church structure and the new thing you're doing? So some of those things may be financial practices. Those things have to be solid, right? The way you maybe count the offering, or another thing is safe sanctuaries policy. If you're going to do anything with kids, that should be uniform. But some multi-sites, they may say, hey, we want you to do the same sermon series, same everything. Then the interdependence model, which is a healthy model, and that creates mutuality. So, think of the new thing that you're starting as the R&D department. And how does that inform the inherited church? And what practices can the inherited church teach that new thing? So you have that mutuality and interdependence. And then the autonomous model, of course, that local dive is having its own unique flavor. And so what we're seeing now is even larger churches are moving more toward that interdependent model to autonomous model. So when we start thinking of North Point and all those, they're actually moving to a model of doing their own series, doing their own song set, because what can happen is we can have and lift up one solo heroic leader. That's the sage on the stage that we pipe in everywhere. And if that person falls away or something happens, it's created a wake. So I do think more of that interdependent model can be healthier in the long run, and even more toward that local dive. But we're seeing our culture shift more toward that, and even local churches where people aren't necessarily going to, yeah, it's a shift from centralized to decentralized model. Absolutely, Kevin. So think about it that way. And some businesses even do this as well in different business models. Or think of Pepsi Corporation. They own Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, all those things. So it's different. It's one parent company, but guess what they serve at all their restaurants? Pepsi. Or think of Procter and Gamble. They have 65 brands, Procter and Gamble, and they make all kinds of different things, but it's still Procter and Gamble. So moving from a centralized model where we're saying, when we say centralized, it's we refer to these as the home, the mother church or the main campus. And when we say that, we're implying that all decisions are made at that centralized hierarchical level instead of the local level. And so that creates a tension, but a decentralized model empowers more of the local dive. It's saying, okay, what is your worship style going to look like? What is your outreach plan going to look like? And those things should be rooted in context. That's why a lot of multi-site churches only plant really in homogenous areas, because that's where they've been successful. And so they're saying, okay, because we've been successful in those areas, let's just keep doing this. But you start getting complicated and complex when you're reaching different demographics within that structure. So if you're starting this new thing and you plan to reach millennials, let's say, the boomers aren't going to understand what you're doing. So sorry, Jason, I kind of went off there, but
That's okay. I wanted to point out just a couple things in the book. One is that we've got a story that starts off with our friend Rachel Gilmore, who planted a church within an existing congregation. Actually, it was a new worship expression. And I think that's probably where a lot of us are. We're not necessarily going to start a second campus, but we might be starting a new worship service within our churches. She tells the story of how there wasn't really a shared understanding up front. And there's a way in which the existing congregation that did traditional worship really looked at this new thing almost as competition and didn't really support it fully in the way that they do the existing worship. So we've seen this in a lot of different settings, but one of the stories she talks about was that their focus, their target audience, which sometimes is a dirty word in the church, but I think it's so important that we know who our target is. If you're starting a new expression, you need a new target audience. It's not the same people because you're doing something that already reaches a certain number of people in the way you're doing it. But if you want to reach new people, you have to have a new target. And how are you going to reach those folks? But anyway, she said our goal was to reach young married couples with kids and unmarried couples, families with young children, college-age kids, and so on. She said the big challenge came in that our church wasn't really willing to support what we were doing with childcare for our service. She said for the first service, the traditional worship experience, they had childcare galore. Everything was fully supported. Here's what she said. I thought this was interesting. And the reason I share this is that if you're going to try something new, you've got to think about supporting the second thing. She said the deck was stacked against us in a sense, because our parent congregation provided no childcare or children's worship on Sunday mornings as the young families continued to grow. In fact, when folks from the legacy congregation saw young families come in with kids, they would attempt to divert them toward the main service without malicious intent. They sort of looked at us as competition. So, that's just one example of this. I was at a church in Indiana a few years ago that brought me in to do a secret worshiper consultation. And they said, we really need help with our non-traditional service. It's newer. It's not as established. It's not growing very well. How can you help us reformulate our recipe for this congregation? I went to that first service, came in, and in their welcome area, literally there were like 5 different types of coffee, like berry coffee and, all this gourmet, like pump after pump after pump, like 5 or 6 different types of pastries, like incredible. Like I felt like I was at a fancy hotel when I walked in. They had like first time visitor gifts and all those sorts of things. I went to worship, experienced their worship. That was a pretty full room and so on. And then I stepped out in between services. I always get out, if I'm going to a church with more than one service, I'll get in my car and drive around for a while. And then I want to come back and see what it's like to enter the parking lot again for the second service. Pull in, there's no greeters at the door. Walk into that welcome area. There was like 1 pump of coffee left in one of the pots. There were a few crumbs of a few pastries left, like, half a donut or whatever that looked like somebody had taken a bite out of it already. And then when I walked into the worship space, there was no bulletin. They didn't have any print piece when I came in. And so afterwards they're asking me about my experience. And I said, well, I'll tell you, one of the reasons that you're not going to grow this second experience is that it feels like it's the unwanted stepchild here at your church. You don't support it. There are no greeters. There are no refreshments. You don't have a print piece. You're not really giving it the same sort of attention that you are that other thing. So we want to encourage you to work through, if you're starting something new, that continuum. In the book, it is on page 92. So you might check that out at some point. And then I want you to pay attention for a second to from 94 on. And Roz, maybe we can touch a couple of these things. We think that there ought to be a letter of intent. Actually take the time to physically write a letter of understanding or a letter of intent between the new thing and the old thing, the established thing. Let me say the established thing and the thing you're trying to do new, whether that's a new service or whatever. Here are some of the areas though, and Roz, we can speak to these, that we think are so important. First is governing structure. And how are you going to have a relationship between two? Roz, why don't you talk a little bit about governing structure a bit?
Yeah, we know what's required in according to our polity, and many churches have moved to kind of a one board model, which has its advantages, but has its disadvantages too, because it pushes a lot of the responsibility on fewer people. And so trying to discern what are the essentials in creating this new thing. If if you have kind of, say it's a new service, have a vision team that's a part of it, and probably key people in that demographic. But you'll want to understand how are finances allocated. If there's any kind of building involved or facilities, that's a kind of a trustees area, quote unquote. But just kind of thinking through those things in terms of what buckets do some of these items fall into, and who has final say and authority. So just kind of establishing that will be a big deal. To give you for instance, right now we're going through this as we adopted a congregation that was declining. And we went through, my church Mosaic went through about an 8-month consultation with them in our mother church, Christ Church. And so after 8 months, we decided to go forward, but we had to be very clear that all of their committees were going to dissolve. So you have the major power brokers who had say for years and years, all of a sudden not have say anymore over finances. They're not voting over things. We're starting new ministries. We're going to flip their physical space. And all of a sudden they're like, whoa, but hey, we go back to our original agreement. We didn't rush this. We told them what we're gonna do, and we were very clear so we can always go back to that. So if you're starting a new service, yeah, that didn't go over well. I'm not very popular right now, but you know what? They had more people show up for a sunrise Easter service than they ever had before. And so I point to the fruit. And once people are doing it, we put a sign up in front of their existing sign. It says it was a generic plain sign. This was a tactic. It was just white with black font. New church coming fall 2021. And all of a sudden, people from the community were reaching out and asking it created a buzz, and some of the older guard were upset by it. And I said, well, how many times have any of your friends asked you before about your church? Well, none. And how many are asking about it now and what's happening? Quite a few. And so all of that goes back to this kind of governing structure. So whenever you're starting that new thing, it's going to be just very clear who has final say over this. We had an informational session with some of the existing members, and we were kind of just touching base and casting vision. And one of the questions was, well, who's making all these decisions? I am. Whose church is this? God's church. And we have a chance of looking at new ministries and reinventing old ministries. So that's somewhat on structure.
Let me add a couple thoughts to that as well. One of them is that, I'll just share one big thought, and that is that whoever is on your board needs to be made up in part, or your leadership needs to be made up in part of those who represent the new thing as well. Sometimes what happens is that we have all of the people making decisions that are from the established thing, rather than having people that are part of the new thing. So if you're starting a new worship experience, you have to have some voices on that team that represent that new worship experience. If you're starting another campus, you need to have folks in the conversation that are a part of that as well, so that all the decisions aren't being made by people who are not stakeholders in what's happening. There's a way in which the new thing that happens gets all the attention, and those who are sort of in the old system and the old structure can be a little jealous that you're getting to do all these fun things and you're getting to spend money on things that we don't get to spend money on, and those sorts of things. So it's really important to have voices at the table that represent both of those things. A couple other things that we think are important. What are you going to do when it comes to children's ministry for whatever your new expression is, whether that's a new service, a new campus, and so on? I just told you a story about Rachel, who said our kids were not supported. If you're starting a second campus, or if you've got new ministry happening somewhere else, the tendency sometimes is to just make the director of the children's ministry of the planting campus, the established campus, be over the person at the new campus. But that doesn't really work because they don't have feet on the ground. They don't know what's happening in ministry in that location. So even some autonomy there. If the person at the new thing has to report to the person at the old thing, tensions can arise and so on. What are you going to do with curriculum? Are you going to have really fancy, nice curriculum at your established thing, and then at the new thing, it's sort of just whoever shows up and provides a lesson? Like, those are the kind of decisions that we think are important for you to think about. Also, the way that we deal with children, the way that we check them in to our system. Do you have a formal child check-in or not at your new thing? Again, sometimes we have all the resources poured into the original thing. And if you're going to that new thing, again, whether that's a second service or whether that's a new campus, we think that's really important as well. Music is a huge one. For whatever that new expression of worship is, how are you treating that? One of the things I sometimes hear churches say when they're starting a new worship experience is that we're going to start contemporary worship. And I would say, what do you mean by that? Well, we're going to do contemporary music. And that doesn't mean that you're doing a contemporary service just because you're doing contemporary music. Sometimes too much of the recipe is cooked from the same ingredients. We have all the same things, but we do slightly newer music. There are all sorts of different expressions of music. The funny thing is, most of what we call contemporary music isn't truly contemporary. You know, I see a lot of churches that do contemporary music and it's like contemporary 1980s. Like, let me break this to you softly, but Shine Jesus Shine and Lord I Lift Your Name on High are not contemporary songs. They were sort of contemporary in the 80s and maybe early into the 90s, but I was at a church in West Virginia who had me come do a consultation, and they had their quote contemporary service, and they called it contemporary because they were singing out of the Faith We Sing instead of the hymnal. Now, I saw a couple smiles. You know what I mean by that. That is not exactly contemporary music. So what type of music are you going to do? And that does not mean that you're doing an expression of worship that is not, you could call it non-traditional, but that does not necessarily mean it's contemporary. Roz, I think you're back. You got anything to add to the conversation on music, or do you want to move on to teaching and preaching?
Well, let's go ahead and move on, and then there's some great questions that are happening in the chat. Jason had some great questions here asked, so maybe we can save a few minutes for questions if that sounds good, Dawn, and really dive into what's kind of burning on your minds. But the sermon series and all that. So as I mentioned, I was at a large church, Ginghamsburg, and I was on staff there as the executive pastor of New Church Development. And as we were going through our multi-campus model, it was interesting because we have the large campus in the cornfield, literally, if you've ever been there before. And it's an amazing place, does great ministry, but it's about 99% white. It's more of a rural. And then we had these two campuses that were in kind of lower socioeconomic, places. And I'd done the duration of my ministry, just to give you just a preview, is I have been always in urban ministry up until this point in my ministry life. So the dynamic of translating the sermon in the series had to appeal to an African-American community, because where I lived and served was about 70% African-American. And we had the diversity that was very different. And so, yeah, Dayton area, Dayton, Ohio, and Darke County, for instance, exactly. It's very different. And so how do you do this? And I remember going to the Point, which was a campus that I was helping to resurrect. And I remember as we were launching Sunday mornings, Ginghamsburg was in a sermon series on finances. And I just said, I'm not launching a new service talking about steward. Now, I love stewardship. In fact, I'm coming out with a stewardship book with my wife that could make for a good series, just a quick plug. But all that to say was I wasn't going to launch that way. And so there were some tensions, and they wanted to name it the Christian Wallet. And I'm like, no, that will not work in my context and setting. And going and hopping on a plane and talking about spending money on vacations and all that, that's not going to translate to my setting either. So we have to really rethink this and reframe it. So who has the autonomy and the call? Right now, as I'm kind of forming a network with Christ Church, kind of our mother church of Mosaic, we're thinking about how do campuses have the flexibility to make those calls and decisions? So what is the DNA that we all play off of? And what are the variables that can change? So the mission should never change, but the methodology can. So we're talking more about a wineskin issue.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple other considerations. Ross talked to you about the idea of the series. are you going to do the same series in the different locations like you heard? I mean, Christian wallet makes doesn't make as much sense in a neighborhood where people don't carry wallets. They don't have anything to put in their wallets versus the upper middle class Lily White area where the main campus was. Also think about the way you dress if you're doing a new expression of worship at your church. I was at a church in near Virginia Beach, not far from there, doing a consultation, and they had me come in secret worship. And in their traditional service, in this traditional sanctuary, the pastor, started out with his robe and his stole and the organ and the choir, all those kind of things. And then for their contemporary service, they had drums and a band. It was in the same space, but drums, band, all that kind of stuff, contemporary music. And the pastor comes out again in his stole and his robe for the contemporary service. And I had to say to him that doesn't match the style of worship that you're doing. And he said, but I just feel like I need to wear my robe and my stole for this space that we're in. And I said, what you look like, how you dress affects the way people feel in that moment. So I said, you don't have to wear a t-shirt and shorts while you preach, but you could put a tie and a coat on and lose the vestments in that moment. So think about how everything you do in that moment, in your new expression, whatever that looks like. If you're going to do a dinner church, you probably don't want to show up in your robe and your stole. It's a different expression. So we think those things are important as well. And then media is another concern. I was at a church in Northern Ohio that had me come do a consultation. And in their first service, they had the full media support, all the graphics. They had a nicely designed bulletin, somebody running that media. It was excellent. And then I came back to the contemporary service, quote contemporary service. It wasn't very contemporary. And the graphics were awful. They weren't filling the screen. Half the time they forgot to change them. They weren't very well designed. They did the bulletin on that particular service was like a half sheet of like salmon colored paper. It had like 4 things on it. Like it was not, they didn't put any of the effort and attention into that they did for the other expressions. So these are some of the things when it comes to preaching and sermons that are important as you're thinking about your new recipe. How much autonomy, how much uniformity is there going to be in what you're doing? Communications is another one. Branding. How are you branding the old thing versus the new thing? And are you giving it the same attention and effort? And even if it's a new service, again, there's a church I went to that had a second service called their Ignite service that really didn't have any it just wasn't supported in the same way. Another church I went to that was a church start, and they had me come to their new campus that was supported by a main campus, a planting church. And they had this beautiful sign out front, wonderful looking logo. I come in the building, they hand me a bulletin. That logo is nowhere on their bulletin. In fact, the name of the senior pastor of the planting organization was at the top of it. I couldn't find anything really about that church in this bulletin. The URL, the web link, when I went to visit it while I was live in church, took me to the main church's website, not to this church. And then finally, at the very bottom, I found campus pastor of this church that I was actually at, the name of his church buried at the bottom of it. And so there was just not a shared understanding of communications. They wanted you to, the planting church wanted you to be very aware of their presence in this church plant and didn't want to allow that church plant to have its own identity and so on and so forth. But for an outsider, they don't even understand. That church is a 10-minute drive from the planting church or the church plant. So think about communications and those sorts of things as well.
And I would say, things from website to logo. I know they sound petty, but they can become golden calves. And when we started Mosaic, we didn't spell these things. So a lot of what we're teaching and sharing comes from lessons. And, you could either memorize the pain or choose to repeat it. And so I rather memorize the pain instead of repeating it. And so some of this, we could have really done well with figuring out, well, what does communications look like? Are we allowed to have our own website, or are we on yours? So if you're starting a different service, do you want that service attached to the existing website or its own creation? We were planting a multi-ethnic church, so we were going to be very different than the existing model and structure. We came up with our we came up with our own logo, but the designer from Ginghamsburg created it. Which, I mean, it's okay, but eventually we're going to rebrand it to what we want it to be now that we're one church in two locations. But we're within a mother church organization, so we're kind of like the R&D department, where we're informing the inherited church of different practices.
And let me also just add that since I was observing all this as it was happening, I remember there was a lot of tension between Ginghamsburg and Mosaic around just the branding. Like, is this a campus of Ginghamsburg? Does the Ginghamsburg logo get to be down in the corner? Or, like, is it okay for you to have your own identity? You came up with the website, wearemosaic.org, which it wasn't We Are Mosaic, campus of Ginghamsburg.org. Things like that actually create tension if you don't work through, the shared understanding. If that was shared, the reason we think this chapter is so important is that if you don't work it out ahead of time, you're going to have constant battles and fights back and forth about every decision, versus having all the really tough conversations about, as we start our new worship experience, are we doing the same series? Does it have its own logo? Are you doing your own graphics? Are we going to give the same sorts of hospitality to this thing that exists where we're at? If you work those things out ahead of time, you will have so much less heartache than you do if you're trying to tackle it every single week at every decision point. Do you want to talk about the Q&A around this portion right now, or do you want to move on to the next chapter? What do you think makes the most sense?
Dawn, I'm going to defer to you on that. What do you think? I don't want to rush through the next material. I'd rather maybe address some questions now. What do you think?
Why don't you take Jason's question and then go from there?
Yeah.
Jason's question. Let's see.
Yeah, I would say, so he asked, first of all, what size staffing structure do you recommend being able to field before you officially launch? I think that's going to depend on your funding model. You don't want to overhire at the start of any new venture, whether it's a church or a business. You could hire in advance in preparation, but you don't want to get too far out, because then those are fixed salaries and fixed expenses going into a new church start, which you don't want to have to like lay off people 6 months later or 9 months later, or when conference funding runs out. So I always kind of, my rule of thumb, if you're trying to start with the essentials, you'll want to maybe have a worship leader part-time, but don't bring them on a year in advance, right? Unless and you can increase the pay scale as more happens, because there may not be enough for them to do. And I always do this in mind. Every staff member is a church planter. So they're not just in their ministry role. They're going to be inviting people to join this new work. So I always think that worship leader position is essential. And then probably 30 years ago, it would have been a student ministry coordinator or a youth pastor. Now I would say that's more of a children's ministry. What do you do with kids? And so I think those two positions are essential. And then try to incorporate, my whole dissertation's on bivocational ministry. I would try to incorporate bivocational folk, or folk that want to be a part of your staff that you don't have to pay. You don't always have to pay people to do ministry. So how do you equip the saints for the work of ministry? Someone may have the gift of administration in your congregation, or this new work that you're starting. So they may say, hey, I'm going to send out the launch updates to the launch team, and I'm going to get things ready before the events. I'm going to go buy the supplies. I'm going to go do these things, but they're building a team as well. So I would move slow as you're hiring, because you don't want to have too many fixed expenses.
The
And how
interesting,
many? Go ahead, Jason.
I was going to say the interesting thing about an unpaid servant or volunteer versus a paid staff person, and I've seen this play out in many of the churches I've worked with. Sometimes you get more out of a servant than you do someone that you pay. You don't ever have to question the motives of somebody that's doing it because they want to do it versus somebody that's doing it for a paycheck. I'm not saying that's always the case, but sometimes when you pay people, they do the minimum amount of work to sort of appease you because you're offering them a paycheck. A lot of times servants, you have to like tell them to slow down. Like, listen, you gotta slow down a bit. You're gonna burn out if you're not careful. You're doing too much. So that's not always the case, but I have found when I was on staff at Ginghamsburg Church back in the day, we had 150 involved in the media ministry, 150 volunteers, and I tell you, there were more than one time that we hired part-time staff or people that worked in the media ministry, and it felt like pulling teeth to get them to do things versus those volunteers who would work circles around those that we were paying. Also, when you find somebody that loves the ministry you're doing, and you help them understand that they're not just running a camera or they're not just playing a guitar, but as Roz said, they're church planners. They see the big picture. Vision casting is an important part of building a team and a staff for new recipes. So those things I think are good as well. And then you asked that question about how long you should plan for. I know in the conference structure, a lot of times it's like you've got 3 years to be solvent. And this is one of those questions that I think you have to wrestle with at every level. But we also have to sort of ask the question, what is the impact that church is having? And is it going to bring financial gain to the church that is planting? Or is it really about the ministry that's happening, the lives that are being transformed? Sometimes the bottom line looks different than the benefit to the kingdom in that season. Raj, you might say more about that. I know you've wrestled with that in the past.
Yeah, I would say, gone are the days where conferences would say you're going to get $300,000 to start this new work. I would say it's safe to say those days are gone. And in fact, some planters don't have that much support. And so as you're budgeting, and I teach church planting master's classes for at United that I created, but I would say that one of their tasks is to form a budget, because pastors have never done that before, or planters have never been taught that before. So you want to forecast as best as you can. Versus, your not just your grants and your financial gifts that you receive, but fundraising as well. It creates some skin in the game for a planter or for the new work you do, because a lot of times planters would get, it would be getting all this sum of money, not doing any kind of stewardship and discipling in that, not asking people to give either because of them receiving these conference funds. And then before you know it, their funding's done and the ministry's done. So how to create something sustainable is huge. So I would forecast your benchmarks of how many people. My whole philosophy is under promise, over deliver. So if in your head you're going to launch with, let's say 150 people, on paper, I would say you plan to launch with 100. Same thing with giving units, how you would figure that out. And it's hard because you don't have a financial history for this new work or this new church. So thinking through those ways, you'll want to keep expenses as low as you can without cutting the muscle or marrow of what you're trying to do. So, thinking about rental space, and I've been through that whole road, staffing, of course, and then the ministry expenses itself. So, thinking of the different funding streams, conferences usually say, hey, 3 years, but you apply every year and you have to show fruitfulness in what you're doing. So you don't want to create a $500,000 a year budget right off the bat if the church can't sustain it, or else you're going to be a flash in a pan, gone by night.
And
And we've seen them.
One other thing I'll add here is that in that governing structure conversation, you have to establish as part of this covenant agreement what the measures of success are. And sometimes we're too focused on the financial success of the church that, or the new service, the new, like, is it solvent? You know, that's like the term that a franchise would use with a franchisee, but in the church, we're not profit driven. So we have to decide, what are the measures of success? Are there attendance numbers we want to hit? Are there, how many people are going to be involved in Bible study or the ministries of the church and so on? These are things that if you determine them up front, you're going to have less stress and tension throughout the life of whatever new thing you're starting than if you're trying to figure it out on the fly and you don't even know, what does this mean for it to be a success? One person may have the idea that it means that you're financially successful. Another might mean that your attendance numbers hit this. So in that covenant agreement for your new service, for your new campus, for your merged church or whatever, those are all important things to talk about. And I just want to respond to Greg's comment that I did hear that they found Jesus' original preaching suit. I understand it was white with like a little blue sash across it. So I've seen that a time or two in a picture here and there. Did we have other questions in the chat or anything else that anyone?
I just dropped a link for my new book or previous work, Funding Ministry on 5 Loaves and 2 Fishes. So how to think through some of these things economically, whether you have an existing building in structure and how to make it generate revenue. I've written a lot for the Lewis Center and all those kinds of things. But again, every planter has to be a fundraiser. Every pastor should be a fundraiser. The local church is so unique from a nonprofit because we have 52 Sundays a year to ask for funds. The key is, how do we do it? And I could do a whole session on a stewardship plan where we have to think through, the days of just receiving money in the offering plate to sustain the budget are done with the changing economic landscape. So how do we think through this differently?
One final thought that occurs to me that I wanted to say earlier that I almost missed is, it also depends on what your fresh expression or your new form of worship looks like where staffing is concerned. For some of us, the number one position, maybe even before children's ministry, is someone to do your online worship experience, your communications, that kind of stuff matters more now than it did in 2019 or at the beginning of 2020. So the way you're going to deliver your entire worship experience, the ministries of your church, the Bible studies, and so on, while we're still dealing with the effects of this pandemic, are a huge consideration. So if you've got some money to spend, having someone dedicated to pulling off what that looks like as it's delivered in an online format, I think is also really important. Jennifer has a question here about multiple smaller churches in the area creating something on their own may be challenging. Do you have any advice? Should several churches want to work together and create a new worship experience? First, I think that's a great thing. And I would certainly encourage you to do that. We're part of a connection. So there's an opportunity for us. The relationships are sort of almost already there, which is a wonderful thing. I have another book that I wrote back in 2009, so it's been a while, called Taking Flight with Creativity, Worship Design Teams That Work. And it's all about the collaborative process and how people can come together and how you form that team and organize it. And I think it would apply to multiple churches working together as well. But this covenant agreement is something you might also do for a group of churches. So there's a shared understanding of, how are we going to split the workload? What type of collaborative experience do we want to create? What does it look like? How are we divvying up responsibilities? All of those sorts of things. Roz, other thoughts you have there?
I would say it's a kingdom of God mindset. And I'm a collaborator. I have a co-pastor. That's kind of what we've done when we started Mosaic. So I would say, as long as expectations are clear on, hey, who's going to be preaching this new event? You know, you might get into a heartburn if you do communion with different, if it's from different traditions. Now, if it's within Methodism, you should be fine. But so just kind of having those answers spelled out will be critical. But I think it's beautiful. It models to the world what we should be about, joining together in common mission in that.
I have to bid you farewell. Roz is going to finish off with you. I have to go and do a 30-day follow-up for my Both And seminar for the Arkansas conference right now. But I will be back with you again next week. Wish you all the best in cooking up something great for people. And we'll see you all later. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Have a good day.
We'll wrap up here. Richard had a question. I kind of started to answer that, but what experience of the pandemic impact have we seen? And I think it just kind of reinforced what the trends had been already, with more the big box attractional model declining. Now, I'm not against attractional. A component of what we do at Mosaic is attractional. But I think there's more of an unapologetic increase and tending to local, to smaller, creating the community and the engagement. And it happens in those on-ramps. People want more smaller, intimate gatherings. And I think online is showing us that. They want those living room shows versus something huge. So it's just kind of what I'm seeing. And a number of churches as well that are unmulti-siting, seeing that more and more and becoming more autonomous and decentralized. So
we have about 3 minutes, Roz. Lloyd has his hand up if you have opportunity to take his question.
yeah.
Not a question. I just want to thank the two of you for the way you presented this, in that while your book is obviously about church starts and entirely new places, the idea of new places for new people can apply to new ministries, new worship services, and new ventures within existing churches to bring new life. So I appreciate the way both in the book and in the presentations have you've noted that, so that like a wider group of people can benefit from these ideas, because a lot of the principles are the same for how you would foster that new life with a chance of it actually succeeding and growing and becoming something. And it doesn't get stifled by what was or what has been, or isn't thrown out on its own and just said succeed on your own.
Thanks, Lloyd. And we wanted to do that in mind. So even the examples we use are very diverse. So if you read through it all, it's different sizes and shapes, because scalability is important. You know, I can go to a conference, and if I'm hearing from Adam Hamilton, I'm not going to be able to relate so much for all their multi-site, even though we include them in the book. But it seems like all their multi-sites have done multi-million-dollar capital campaigns. I can't really relate to that, but I might relate to Jason McAnally or the Urban Village folks we talked about, or the different models, Sarah Heat. So yeah, we wanted to keep that in mind. And then William had a comment, I think, here. Do you have more suggestions to help them still feel worthy in the new ministry? I think giving them some sort of role and responsibility is huge and critical. So all of this comes down to vision casting. What is God's preferred future, and what can it look like? So with the folks of St. Andrews, the adopted church that we're working with, we're kind of casting a picture of what we're looking toward, and they're seeing glimpses of it. So when we do these events and they have 100 kids show up for kids camp in the future, they're going to say, oh, wow, no wonder we needed that new playground. Or, oh, no wonder we're changing this or that. So I think you just share the stories, you vision cast, And at the same time, you try to steer people and say, hey, you have a role here. Everybody has a role. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be the decision maker in that role, but everyone has a role, a hand to play, especially as you're starting something new. It's not just passing out a bulletin. It's not just making coffee. Everything, even the smallest of things, can be done with great love, like Mother Teresa says.
Amen. And Roz, we're just at noon. Any last concluding words you want to share?
I would just say to folks, don't be overwhelmed right now. You're doing it all, and the task may seem overwhelming, but Jesus is still Lord, and God is calling you. And don't give up. I want to actually that's been in my mind and my heart as I've been hearing more and more clergy leaving this year. The words "don't give up" come to mind. So I want to encourage you, friends.
Amen. On that note, Roz, that is something heavy on my heart as well. So thank you for that. And Jason, Roz, and I were talking about even online ministry. Think of that as a local dive as well. And maybe we can dive into that a little bit in the upcoming weeks. But thank you, dear friends. We try to stay right on time. So I know there might be a few more questions or comments, but we'll try to get to those next week. And many blessings on your afternoon. Thanks, Roz. Take care today.
Thank you. Thanks.